And definitely for taxation also, he has policy. Yes. Yes, preferably going off these roads first. And making lots of people beholden to them.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're here for the fourth and final lecture in this year's winter lecture series with the topic of the America First Doctrine. We've gone through the first three, a historical approach to the America First policy or doctrine. We had a presentation on the economic or the trade aspects, and we had a presentation last week on the social aspects, primarily immigration-related topics. And today we're going into foreign policy. And foreign policy related to America First is about as timely a topic as we can get, given the news of the past 8 or 10 days with our administration waving the banner of America First. Our speaker today is well known to most of you, Professor David Forsythe, and he will talk to this topic. Let me tell you a little bit about him. I say a little bit because I'd use up his whole 90 minutes if I told you a lot about him. But Dave Forsythe was born in North Carolina. He grew up in Richmond, Virginia, where he distinguished himself on the high school basketball court. He then went on to college at Wake Forest University, which is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And after completing his bachelor's degree, he was accepted into the graduate program in what's called politics or political science at Princeton University in New Jersey. He earned his master's and his PhD in political science and with a focus on the subdivision of international relations. His dissertation research was based on in the Middle East. After teaching for a year at Agnes Scott College and Georgia State University, each in Atlanta, he accepted a position here on the faculty of the Department of Political Science at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he remained for almost 40 years, during which time he served for a period of time as the department chair. His focus, of course, was on international relations. As his career developed, he became quite interested in human rights and human relations. And his research and his speaking interest shifted. He focused primarily on the Committee of the International Red Cross and its counterpart in Islamic countries, the Red Crescent. He did quite a bit of research over the years in Geneva, where the Red Cross is based. He had assignments in other parts of the world. He had visiting professorships in a few places, including Denmark. But he remained here to the benefit of the university and its constituents, its students, its faculty here for the rest of his career. At one point, toward the end of his career, he became acknowledged as probably the primary mover in the world in the subfield of human rights within the discipline of political science. And there is, in the political science department, there is a Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs named for the Forsythe family, thanks to an endowment from his family and from other people. And that continues to thrive. And in fact, the speakers last week also had an affiliation with that program. So today, he's not exactly talking about human rights and humanitarian affairs, although certainly there are ramifications in that area of the America First policy as is being conducted today and historically. So without further ado, let me give you Professor David Forsythe.
Thank you, Peter. Very nice introduction. I was gratified to see that you read it the way my wife drafted it. I thought that was very nice of you. Thanks to all of you for coming and for the people who are tuned in by video. I know it's a very nice afternoon. You could be playing golf or tennis or doing all sorts of important things, so it's very nice of you to come to this event or link to it. I'm going to jump right in without further ado. I'm going to do two things. I want to situate Trump foreign policy and his talk about America First in historical perspective. And then I want to, in the second part, address the America First theme in more detail. So those are the two things I'm going to do. I notice a number of our other speakers have had trouble advancing the slides. I'm not sure I'm going to be any more successful. Whoops.
Hang on, I don't know what happened. Give me just a moment. Try it again.
There we go. Very good. To jump to my conclusion about this historical review, to give you the teaser, to give you the trailer up front, I think America First means we're headed back to 1914. What do I mean by that? If you go back to 1914 and look at world affairs, there are very few international laws and very few international organizations that exist at that time. There are virtually no international rules and regulations about world affairs in 1914 and the years before that. So if you take 1914 and Austria wants to make war on Serbia because Serbs have assassinated an Austrian official, which is the way World War I starts, there's nothing to prevent Austria from doing that. Making war is an act of state. There are no treaties on what is self-defense and what is aggression. What happens to change things initially is World War I. There is so much carnage, there is so much destruction in World War I that Woodrow Wilson takes the lead in trying to change international relations, make it more regulated, make it more peaceful, make it safer, eventually make it perhaps more just. In the Battle of the Somme in north-central France, you have 60,000 casualties in that battle, 20,000 of which are fatal. In the Battle of Verdun in northern France, over several days and weeks, you have maybe 750,000 casualties. This is so shocking to everyone, including at least a few Americans, that there's a determination to try to create more international laws and international organizations to do something about the absence of world government, to at least produce world governance. Not government, but governance, meaning better management of foreign policy, international relations. So, as everybody knows, you get the League of Nations. Wilson proposes and pushes for the League of Nations at the end of World War I, and I give you there, upper right, of course, the photo of Woodrow Wilson, but then below that, the original League of Nations building in Geneva, Switzerland, which is now the European Office of the United Nations. And beyond the League of Nations, there are all sorts of treaties about first use of force, about aggression, about self-defense, an effort to regulate particularly violence. And there are other treaties developed in the interwar years. And to make a long story short, we all know this failed. The League of Nations failed. The United States never joined. And even back then, we were potentially the most powerful nation in the world. If you looked at particularly our economy, industrial capacity, that's why Wilson was created as a kind of almost a king after World War I at the Versailles Peace Treaty, and why he spent so much time in Paris negotiating that treaty and in other places in Europe, because everyone could see what was coming, which was the United States was going to be, to put it in the words of Madeleine Albright much later, the United States was going to be the essential nation in international relations. Well, by 1939 and the German invasion of Poland to start our version of World War II, it actually started before that, the League of Nations was dead. The League of Nations was irrelevant, in part because we were never a member, but for other reasons as well. What is perhaps interesting, I know there's some historians here, so I'm stealing their thunder, but what is maybe interesting in historical perspective is that after World War II, with even more carnage, more damage, the use of the atomic bomb, but even aside from that, the firebombing of Tokyo, the firebombing of Dresden, after all of that destruction, in a way, the decision was to double down on Woodrow Wilson's view. To go back to Wilson's view that what we needed was more international law and more international organization, because international relations unregulated was so dangerous and so disastrous. We, of course, here focus on American casualties, and we focus on the D-Day landings. This is pretty much nothing compared to the Russians. We had World War II, I don't know, 450,000 casualties, something like that. The Russians had 25 million, maybe 10 million combat, total of 25 million killed because of starvation, famine, illness, etc. So you had even more destruction. It was even clearer that something needed to be done about international relations. And so after World War II, there was an expanded attempt to try to regulate foreign policy and international relations better. So there, bottom left, I give you the picture of the United Nations in New York. And the United Nations, in a way, is League of Nations 2.0. The United Nations is, in a way, a more authoritative, slightly more muscular League of Nations where the UN Security Council is supposed to regulate recourse to war. And according to the strict wording of the Charter, the only legal first use of force is if an armed attack has occurred on the state going to war. Well, there's much more to the story than that, obviously. But there was a renewed effort to regulate violence. I give you a iconic picture of Eleanor Roosevelt holding a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There was a whole raft of treaties and other documents on human rights. So it was not only an effort to regulate violence after World War II, there was an effort to adopt treaties on human rights. And I could talk about trade as well. We already had one presentation in this series on economics and trade and tariffs. But eventually we got the World Trade Organization, which is moribund now. But for a while it was a quite interesting effort because there you had something very rare. You had the United States accepting the right of an international organization to have the last say on tariffs and trade. In the Security Council, of course, we have the veto. So the Security Council sort of has the last say on regulating violence, but there are 5 states who can veto certain resolutions there. On the trade issue in the World Trade Organization, for a while, it was the appellate level of the World Trade Organization that had the last say as to what was legal tariffs and trade. And just as a final example, outside the UN system, through the network of the International Red Cross, you had the negotiation of the 1949 Geneva Conventions regulating the process of war, treatment of prisoners of war, treatment of civilians in occupation, protection for hospitals which were not supposed to be made the object of attack. The UN Security Council was supposed to regulate the first use of force, the recourse of force. It was the laws of war that were supposed to regulate the process of war. And the 1949 Geneva Conventions figure in that scheme. My point in general is that after World War II, you had a renewed effort to create international laws and organizations to make international relations a safer place, more humane place, more just place. The first election of Donald Trump, 2016, combined with the British withdrawal from the European Union, represents the beginnings of a big rupture with this long historical process to try to create more and more powerful international laws and international organizations. So you have the election of Donald Trump in 2016 in the great wisdom of the American voters, but I think I'll not chase that rabbit. And you have another very important state, the British, in the United Kingdom, deciding to pull out of the European Union. We talk about Brexit. It's really kind of an English rather than a British decision to exit, because my people, the Scots, the Scottish part of the United Kingdom, voted to stay in the European Union. It was sort of rural England that tipped the balance in pulling out. But the more important point is you have two major states in international relations returning to or activating or endorsing or choosing what I will call a narrow nationalism, which leads to a questioning, if not a rejection, of most international laws and organizations. And this trend is confirmed in 2024 after the Biden brief era with the election of Trump for a second term. And I would say the Trump second term is definitely America first in the sense of kind of American narrow nationalism on steroids. That's a scholarly term which I can explain as I go along. Today in Britain, certainly among the elites, you have a debate, a little bit of buyer's remorse about pulling out of the European Union. We can talk about that if you want. But with the election of Donald Trump, you have a doubling down on a rejection of Wilsonian liberalism. You have a doubling down of the view that Woodrow Wilson was greatly in error, and more or less American foreign policy, sweeping generalization, was headed in the wrong direction in the last 70 years in trying to build up international law and organization to make international relations a safer place. And in this, Trump was greatly aided in the Heritage Foundation, because in Trump's first term, he actually was not very effective in doing what he was trying to do. He was new to politics. He had never held office. He had never certainly held national office, but also never held state and local office. He really didn't know how to operate in Washington and do what he wanted to do. The Heritage Foundation, laying out its Plan 2025, Program 2025, under Voigt, the head of the Heritage Foundation, who's now the Director of Management and Budget in the second administration, Trump has been much more effective in the sense of moving the American First agenda along and proceeding to carry out systematic attacks on most international organizations and most international laws. I won't talk about what this means at home, but my mandate is to address foreign policy. Trump gave a quite remarkable interview to the New York Times in which he said more or less, he believed in an explicit rejection of most international law. He didn't need international law as guardrails because he was restrained by his personal morality. If you know something about Trump's private life and his business record, you can raise your eyebrows about his personal morality, but we can talk about that as well, too. Oh, yes, I give you the picture there not only of Voigt, as he is nominated to be head of the Office of Management and Budget rather than head of the Heritage Foundation, but also the picture of Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, who at the Davos meeting of the World Economic Forum, which is a kind of high-level talk shop held each year in Switzerland, with the headquarters outside of Geneva, but this meeting in Davos, which gets a lot of press attention, it was there that the Prime Minister of Canada talked about the present situation representing not just a kind of tinkering with recent foreign policy and international relations, but a rupture with the past. And I think that's a rather interesting and provocative way of talking about all of this. Trump foreign policy did not come out of nowhere. I continue with the quick historical overview. Trump foreign policy did not come out of nowhere. I would say that Republicans had been trending toward unilateralism rather than multilateralism. Republicans had been trending toward a kind of unilateral narrow nationalism rather than strong belief in the United Nations and other international organizations. I think this trend had been going on, in my view, since 1980 and the election of Ronald Reagan. I used to use a book in my class on American foreign policy that was entitled The Rogue Nation, The Rogue Nation. That author was not talking about Trump, who hadn't appeared on the scene yet. That author was talking about the Reagan administration, who appointed someone to the UN who was caustic about the UN, Jeane Kirkpatrick. It was the Reagan administration that pulled the US out of UNESCO and some other international organizations. It was Reagan who invaded Grenada on the spur of the moment without either international or domestic approval, which maybe reminds us of Iran today, but we can talk about that. However, before I beat up too much on this trend in Republican foreign policy, I want to point out that all presidents in their foreign policy have a mix of unilateralism and multilateralism. It's never totally one or the other. And I give you a couple of reminders about George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush. On the one hand, in 1989, he went into Panama unilaterally, seized Noriega, not Maduro, seized Noriega, and brought him to the U.S., had him convicted of various charges, and then sent him off to France, where he was also subjected to French courts and so forth. But all of that was an example of George H.W. Bush and kind of unilateral intervention into the affairs of another state, claiming self-defense on the part of the U.S., but basically it was a controversial universal action, very similar to Venezuela today. And yet, in 1991, George W. Bush, I think, did a masterful job of organizing the response to Saddam Hussein's invasion on behalf of Iraq of Kuwait and seizing the Kuwait oil fields. There, under the first President Bush's direction, we wound up the United States wound up with something like 45 states, 44 I think maybe, 44 states fighting against Iraq under U.S. direction. And it was a very successful military operation that had both international and domestic approval. And Japan paid a lot of the bills because Japan wasn't contributing forces, but Japan wanted to be part of this international coalition. So you have, with the first President Bush, a very good example of a mixture of going it alone, doing what you want to do, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, in a unilateral way, and on the other hand, marshaling a very broad coalition on the basis of very broad diplomatic support to repel the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So again, my point is, all presidents are a mixture of unilateralism and multilateralism. And I would remind you that at the end of the Reagan era, at the end of his second term, he struck a very good arrangement with Gorbachev, leader at that point of the ill-fated Soviet Union. And he and Gorbachev were talking about a kind of reinvigorated United Nations that would do all sorts of good things. And Reagan had a very positive view of Gorbachev, as did George H.W. Bush, who followed, because both President Reagan and first President Bush thought Gorbachev was a reliable partner, somebody you could deal with. And in fact, sort of footnote to all of this, George H.W. Bush, when he became president, and his Secretary of State, James Baker, were not in favor of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They did not support Yeltsin. They did not support Russian nationalism. They supported the Soviet Union because they saw Gorbachev as someone that they could deal with who would help create, with the United States, a reinvigorated United Nations, which would make world affairs better and safer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you have a mix and you have lots of nuances, you have lots of historical footnotes. But to get back to where we're going about Trump and America first, I would still say that in general, Republican foreign policy has been trending toward a kind of America first position, a kind of strong unilateralism. We want to do what we want to do, and if international law doesn't permit this, if the UN Security Council doesn't approve this, then too bad. And I would remind you of something that's relevant, maybe, hopefully not, to Iran today, U.S. intervention in Iran today, and that is George W. Bush. That is Bush II, George W. Bush, and his invasion of Iraq, which did not have the approval of the UN Security Council. And because it did not fit with international law, France and Germany, two of our most important allies, were open in their opposition to that invasion. You may remember that we stopped calling French fries, and we called them freedom fries because we were mad at France for France not supporting our invasion of Iraq. That's how petty and picayune some of the debate gets. And it also might be relevant to Iran today, I hope not, that when the Bush administration, the second Bush team, went into Iraq without the kind of support that the first Bush team had in liberating Kuwait, we got into quite a mess, and we had quite a difficult time, and we had a long, drawn-out struggle in Iraq after 2003. We had the prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib prison. We had all sorts of difficulties putting down opposition to our occupation of Iraq. Boots on the ground got a very bad name out of all of that. But the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and subsequent difficulties showed again a U.S. determination to push ahead on the basis of what we thought was the right thing to do at the time, and the fact that it didn't fit with international law, the fact that there was strong foreign criticism of what we were talking about doing, indicates support for my point that Trump foreign policy didn't come out of nowhere, that much but not all Republican foreign policy had been trending in a kind of narrow nationalistic unilateral direction, I think ever since the Reagan administration. And this gets us more directly into Trump and leads into a couple of more points that'll make my argument even clearer, I think. I think now, with regard particularly to the second Trump administration, you have a pretty clear rejection of much of international law and many international organizations. I won't give you direct quotes from the 2026 U.S. National Defense Statement, 2026 U.S. National Defense Statement, which is only about a month old. But if you want to go to Google, all you have to do is go to Google, put it in AI mode, and type in U.S. National Defense Statement, and you'll see that you have a pretty clear statement of Trump unilateralism. That's a fairly neutral term, unilateralism. And one of the main architects of all of this is Stephen Miller, who is an advisor in the White House. He's a deputy director of the White House office in charge of security affairs. He is perhaps better known for a hard line on immigration and deportation, but he's a major player. He's a major advisor on foreign policy in general. And he says explicitly in the National Defense Statement and also in various interviews he's given to the press that world affairs is really about hard power. It's really about coercion, military coercion, economic coercion, and all the rest of this stuff about international law and organization is just expendable, superficial niceties. It's a rejection on the part of the United States for the first time of what we political scientists call soft power. And here I would draw a comparison between dominant power and hegemonic power. Maybe this gets a little too academic. I won't spend forever on this. But there's a difference in trying to coerce Canada into doing what you want them to do by applying punitive tariffs and nasty statements and trying to dominate them, and on the other hand, by appealing to Canada, come join with us, we'll respect your interest, we'll partner with you, we stand for democracy, we stand for rule of law, we all stand for the same thing. You can take an effort to build support, sure, on occasion through coercive power, but also by using soft power, by appealing, well, perhaps to quote one academic author, by appealing to the better angels of our nature, by trying to build a coalition at its core that supports human rights, rule of law, democracy, and others. Yes, you need coercive power, but there's also soft power. What you have in the view of Stephen Miller and others is a sort of rejection of soft power and talk about, well, it's all about case-to-case application of hard power. And if you want to do something and you have the power to do it, you do it regardless of international law or the lack of approval of UN Security Council or other international organizations. I wouldn't want to push this too far. Having indicated the sort of major trend, I don't think the Trump administration has reached the point of rejecting all cooperation, all parts of international organizations. We stay a member of the United Nations, in part because we value our position in the UN Security Council with a veto. So, for example, where you have a lot of criticism of Israel, resolutions introduced critical of Israel, U.S. finds it very useful to have the veto and be able to veto those resolutions, very critical of Israel. We remain a member of NATO. And in fact, I give Trump credit up to a limit. He has gotten the rest of NATO to pay more into NATO. It used to be we were paying 4 or 5% on defense expenditures, and the Europeans were paying 1% or 2%. They are now paying 4 and 5% of their GDP on security, some of which relates to NATO. So we stay in the UN, although we pulled out, Trump has pulled out of the World Health Organization and the UN Council, which used to be the Commission. And I should also say that, of course, you have the Board of Peace for Gaza, supposedly for Gaza. And that is an international arrangement of sorts. So it's not as if there is no evidence of Trump foreign policy being part of international organizations, which are built on international law. But by and large, the thrust of Trump foreign policy is toward a kind of America First version, strongly unilateral, and even some of the examples I've cited about remaining multilateralism or internationalism are quite controversial and have a number of negative features as well. I'll go ahead and give you one example to indicate specifically what I'm talking about. Yes, we are still members of NATO. And it's possible that Trump foreign policy there will work out just fine, but at the moment what you have is, yes, the Europeans paying more into NATO and other military programs, but they no longer trust the United States. They no longer trust the United States to come to their defense. And it was not helpful, the recent flap we had with regard to Denmark over Greenland. Let me now address America First in some detail. There were a number of supporters of President Trump who thought that America First meant a kind of renewed isolationism. There were certainly people in the MAGA movement who believed that Trump represented a new type of American isolationism, similar to what the American First Committee wanted back in the early 1940s, as we heard in the first talk in this series. And certainly the early Trump campaigning in 2016 talked about the mistakes made in the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's a reason why Marjorie Taylor Greene expected Trump to be a neo-isolationist based on his campaigning and based on at least parts of his first administration. And even with regard to Ukraine, the second Trump administration has seemed very lukewarm, very conflicted, certainly not firmly in support of Ukraine as a democratic state resisting Russian aggression. You don't get those kinds of speeches, you don't get those types of interviews on Ukraine coming out of the second Trump administration. Now, in the 2026 National Defense Statement, there is finally an explicit rejection of isolationism, and I'm not sure Trump had a very big hand in writing this document, but the people whoever wrote this document, trying to figure out what Trump wanted, explicitly rejected isolationism, in part because people like Marjorie Taylor Greene were growing very unhappy with Trump foreign policy. And of course, you have endorsement of a new version of the Monroe Doctrine. Rather than being fully isolationist, it's again a proclamation like the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 that the Western Hemisphere is ours and we will take all sorts of action in the Western Hemisphere, such as the seizure of Maduro, whatever international law might say about state sovereignty and domestic jurisdiction. It's very clear, looking at the Trump second administration, that whatever American First means, it doesn't mean isolationism. You have broad, muscular, coercive, unilateral involvement in Venezuela, Iran twice, and that's not over. U.S. Took ownership of the problem of Gaza and tried to do something about it. Bombing in Nigeria, diplomatic involvement in South Africa, and allegations, false allegations, of a black genocide against whites. And even in Ukraine, we haven't completely walked away from that. Even in Ukraine, where there is great ambivalence against the background of a certain Trump apparent affection for Putin or something going on there, we are still involved in support of Ukraine in various ways, even if it's not full-throated, even if it's not firm and major, even if we don't talk much about, the Trump team doesn't talk about Russian aggression or defense of democracy. There is still a commitment to help Ukraine, either by providing intelligence to fight the Russians, or by allowing the Europeans to buy weapons from us and turn over the weapon systems to Ukraine. So even there, it's not, whatever the Trump ambivalence about Ukraine is, whatever the Trump similarity with the old America First in sort of being neutral toward Europe, the Trump team has not really walked away from Ukraine yet, this week, as of now. What you have, particularly in the second Trump administration, is a redefinition of American First to mean whatever Trump wants it to mean. It's certainly not neo-isolationism. It's a kind of narrow nationalism based on coercive power and said to be pursuit of anything in the U.S. national interest. I'll point out that U.S. national interest has no scientific definition. There is no set definition of what is and is not in the U.S. national interest. It's an argument, it's a construction, and people argue about it. Is it in the U.S. national interest to invade Cuba next? Yes, no, maybe. Is it in the U.S. national interest to let arms treaties expire? You have people for, you have against. You always have definitions and debates. And, I lack a good name for the nature of Trump foreign policy these days, except there is, I would say, almost universal agreement that U.S. foreign policy is highly personalized. U.S. national interest is what Trump says it is. It changes case by case. It changes week by week. Are tariffs on Brazil in the U.S. national interest? Some time ago, yes. Today, less so. Economic sanctions, tariffs on Italy for pasta coming into the United States. Well, very high tariff on Italian pasta, but retracted. Is a military takeover of Greenland in the U.S. national interest or counterproductive to the U.S. national interest? Well, at one point, Trump said that he needed to own Greenland for reasons of national security, but that was a few weeks ago. And not so much talk anymore about the need to take over Greenland, which is a Danish self-governing territory. There are two documents that I invite you to look up. I've already mentioned the National Defense Statement. By the way, I don't think these documents mean all that much, but they're sort of interesting to look at anyway. American foreign policy is very personalized. It's very case by case. And the Trump version of the national interest changes all the time. There is also a national security strategy statement. In addition to the National Defense Statement of, I guess, late January 2026, there is a National Security Strategy Statement of November 2025. And that's also a useful document to look at. Both documents suggest very clearly that whatever America First means, it doesn't mean neo-isolationism. I'll talk a little bit more about the 2025 security strategy statement in a minute, but I just want to mention these two. And I give you the picture of Vice President Vance because, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like Tucker Carlson, Vance was seen early on as a traditional American firster who believed in avoiding a lot of foreign military interventions. And on Iran these days, he's been very quiet. Vance hasn't said a lot about the Iranian situation because he, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and other maybe neo-isolationists, certainly in the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson, Trump has moved in a different direction. I give you there, actually, the picture of our Congressman Mike Flood. Why would I do that? It's a very good question. That's a picture of Mike Flood in his office with a representative from Denmark. And Flood worked pretty hard, very quietly, to oppose Trump policy on Greenland and Denmark. And it was his office that released this photo showing him in discussions in his Washington office with people from Denmark, working together to try to change Trump's stated policy about needing to own Greenland by any means necessary, which suggests possibility of military force. And certainly for Mike Flood's point of view, and lots of others, including the President of France, et cetera, this was definitely not in the U.S. national interest to be talking this way. So you have a trend toward interventionism, even discussion of a military attack on a NATO ally, like Denmark. That's a pretty extreme example of possible unilateralism, narrow nationalism, doing what you want to do because you have the power to do it, whatever international law and NATO members and members of the European Union might say. And I think what you have now is a kind of trend toward erratic, muscular foreign policy, military and diplomatic interventions around the world, quite uncertain, and sometimes subject to change and rollback, as on the rhetoric about Denmark. So I think when we address Trump, America First, and the main principle of the American First Committee in the early 1940s, you can say that the American First Committee was much more anti-interventionist than the Trump administration is today. And whatever America First means to Trump, it does not mean a kind of neo-isolationism. Now, the second thing we talked about with the American First Committee in the early 1940s was its anti-Semitic nature, not maybe by formal design, but because of the involvement of Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford and Father Conlon and known anti-Semites. Trump is clearly not anti-Semitic. You cannot pin that label on him with any logic. There are many examples, and of course, we are constantly now bombing Iran in alliance with Israel. Trump has been very sympathetic to Israel all along. This is setting aside all kinds of personal connections with Jewish and Zionist elements in his personal life. There are lots of connections there, very favorable relations there, starting with his daughter. But at the same time, on Gaza, Trump was very firm with Israel and forced Netanyahu into a kind of partial ceasefire that Netanyahu did not want. And that's one of the things, one of the positive things that Trump has achieved, is that you have fewer Palestinians being killed today by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. The ceasefire is porous. The ceasefire is not working 100%, but there are fewer Palestinians being killed these days than before the ceasefire was announced. And the ceasefire is almost solely due to Trump's pressure on the Netanyahu government in Israel. There's a lot more we could say about Trump and anti-Semitism. I'll be glad to come back to that in some of the Q&A. But if you change the question and you say, for Trump, does American First imply anti-Semitism? No. Does it imply a kind of racism? That's probably the right question to ask. And there are lots of people who see Trump as part of a white supremacist movement at home and abroad. I leave out for now the religious dimension because for anybody who follows events, Trump is not religious. He's not Christian. He doesn't practice Christian principles. And that's perfectly obvious, but we can discuss this. I do invite you to go to Google and look up the National Security Strategy Statement of November 2025 and look at the section on Europe. It's very revealing. And again, who knows who wrote this document? Who knows if the president ever approved it? This statement is late last year. But this is what the Trump team says about Europe. The problem with Europe, note the lecturing of our allies. The problem with Europe is they admit too many people from non-white countries. Europe is losing its identity as a white Christian civilization, and if they continue with their loose immigration policies, they will not be worth allies that we can support. I think that section of that public document, again, definitely not written by Trump, but was it even approved by Trump? Did Trump even read it? Are very good questions, but you do have a kind of statement that sheds light on this whole question of whether, for Trump, America first means a kind of white supremacy in world affairs. And our speakers last week pointed out that the only refugees now admitted to the U.S. are white South Africans who supposedly are fleeing a genocide by the black government, which is a false statement. As CBS, Anderson Cooper just ran an expose of the Trump argument that there's some kind of genocide going on in South Africa, and therefore we should accept these white entrants. Well, I have tested your patience for a while now. I could go on a little bit about America First and the racist dimension for Trump. You'll be happy to know I'm going to, let's see. Okay, we can come back. Trump and Putin, Trump and the white South Africans, the infamous video that was circulated by the White House presenting the Obamas as apes, provoking very strong reaction from the few black Republicans that exist. We can come back to those. It's time for me to wrap this up. I would remind you of my arguments. I see U.S. foreign policy under Trump, particularly in the second administration, as highly personalized. I do refer you to a couple of documents which I think are instructive, but I don't think documents mean very much in this administration. I call your attention to an interview given by Susie Wiles. You say, who's Susie Wiles? She's not Secretary of State, she's not Secretary. Susie Wiles runs Trump's office in the White House. And she gave a series of interviews, I think it was Vanity Fair. And one of the things she says is that Trump has an alcoholic personality in that he needs to dominate the way an alcoholic needs another drink. He has to win. He has to dominate. He has to be successful in coercion. That's his approach to all sorts of issues. And coming from Susie Wiles, this is worth taking note of. Relatedly, I see, my opinion, my interpretation, perfectly free to disagree, at the heart of U.S. foreign policy, there is a void beyond U.S. domination. U.S. foreign policy is not committed to human rights and democracy in foreign policy. They say so in these documents. They say, we don't do democracy promotion anymore. They say, we don't address the human rights situation in other countries. Doesn't mean they don't, but that's what they say. I think they had Saudi Arabia in mind when they say we defer to national traditions and we don't really take up human rights questions anymore. I think they were thinking of Saudi Arabia and autocratic allies like that. But they do take up human rights questions. That's the rationale for admitting white South Africans as refugees. That's the rationale for bombing in Nigeria under the erroneous argument that what's going on in Nigeria is strictly attacks on Christians. It's not, it's crime. In South Africa, it's crime. Most people affected in South Africa by crime are blacks, not white farmers. But they say in the documents, we don't do democracy, we don't do human rights. They don't say in the documents, we don't believe in international law, but they don't. Stephen Miller will say it, they don't say it in the documents. So I see a great void in U.S. foreign policy, and hence it is a rupture with much of past U.S. foreign policy. And in the Q&A period, I invite your questions about NATO, Gaza, Venezuela, terrorists, migrants, Iran, and anything else you want to address. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll stop there. And it was a pleasure to be invited to throw out these thoughts for your discussion.
Take a break for about 5 or 7 minutes and then come back for Q&A.
Offering drones and not giving them weapons, and then Putin helps Iran. This school was asked about it, and he says.
Well, you're very kind. And in the Q&A, if I get questions that I can answer.
You can't, well, you can't help it, but it is reality, that this is our reality. Yes, that was, must have been about 70 people, wasn't it? Yeah, they said 60, but no, I think it was 70. Yeah. And what I was pleased about, there were at least 30 women there, because that group is historically, you know, UNL professor emerita. Well, I mean, that's half of it, and then Ollie. But I was pleased to see that if it was 60, but I think it was about 70, there were 30 women, and I thought that was great. Yeah, Dave is no dummy. He's extremely astute. His command of all of this, but I just think it's extremely sobering. Well, I think a lot of people are number one, Zooming, or they're enjoying the weather, or isn't there a basketball game before now? I stopped erroneously to get something to keep me awake, and O Street was just full of those hot rods and motorcycles. I mean, I couldn't even get across O Street, and I had to get across O Street to come east.
A loss of support in one faction. They're not going to vote Democratic, but if they say no, they don't vote.
And I'm Becky Brooks. I should introduce myself.
I got to sit down.
Nice to meet you. Do you every month go to the International Affairs meeting?
Standing still. An hour.
It's September through May, 3 to 4:30, and I think only once they had to move away from the first Wednesday from your library because something else was scheduled. I think Peter schedules the rooms as soon as he can, but even if it's something I know a lot about, it's always interesting. It's outstanding. Well, I hope you can too. There are people who don't come to
For politics, that'd be great.
if it weren't for politics, but that's invaded almost every aspect of our life. Whether it's government, finance, climate.
Yeah.
I, this morning, heard a very interesting presentation by John Berge, B-E-R-G-E-L, he says that quite that way. He, all the way back to Jim Exon, was in sort of governmental org politics, Kerry, Nelson, Obama administrations, primarily from agricultural, Farm Services Administration, and now he is a clean energy consultant. And just very impressive.
Just starting,
And
Michigan
part of his thing
Michigan
was
State
about
would help Nebraska. If Michigan State takes it under law,
what is it, down
that gives us
Highway
that second seat.
77, Panama.
Would that play UCLA?
And now there's a proposal in Alma to do a clean energy project, so that'll be real interesting.
I'm also fascinated with a lot of coffee. Where did you
There we go. Oh, Carolyn Boston.
has a proposal, isn't going anywhere, but she proposed it last year, rejected it, again this year, that would really support the idea.
You mean the next session in 27?
Maybe it'll go somewhere this year, but she
I,
didn't seem to think so, but it would be very supportive of communities that are more welcoming.
well, isn't usually Elliot Ostar a champion of that? I mean, there's maybe some semi-conflicts of interest or what else he wants to do politically, but he's one that I associate with that. Frankly, I usually think of Carolyn Boston in terms of juvenile justice or whatever, but she's been more moderate than I expected she would be, considering
I agree.
that wasn't she a Pillen appointee and then elected in her own right and had paid money similar to Geist, who I hope stays in the background.
I never saw anything to appreciate about guys. It's pretty interesting. And apparently both Nebraska being said has gotten a bunch of money to go out to rural Nebraska. These are the benefits, and here's how we can maximize the benefits for you from these projects.
For clean energy.
For clean energy, if you want. They're going to do clean energy. What does it take to make it really worthwhile community?
That was the scary thing.
What do you want from that? The closing is simply look at, we will make it easier, if you make it easy for companies to locate, we will give you extra tax.
Well,
The taxes they pay will go extra into your coffers.
even the bureaucracy of the permitting is a substantial barrier
It's a substantial barrier. Right now, it is the biggest barrier.
because the locals and county and commissioners who want to be reelected, it goes on and on and on.
And it's not just for them, but also the constituents out there.
Well, our grid is aging, we've got to do something, and that's costly, and so there has to be something in terms of the next generation or whatever.
I know, yeah, if it's like.
Have you read that? Okay, never mind.
About what? Oh, good, thank you.
The criticism of liberals and how we have summed up the system of we can't get things done because we want to do too many things in each project.
Nader's new book, I hope there are a lot of I haven't read it, but I've heard about it.
Years getting in the way.
Yeah.
How many times do you think screw things up? They started out wonderful and then
See, my mind is wandering. Nader, California, I noted something. There were 4 governors who were in Dover to receive bodies, and there were 6 fallen soldiers. 2 were from Iowa. Iowa was there. 1 was from Florida. 1 was there for Nebraska, and I've forgotten the other state, but California, the governor wasn't there. And that's quite unlike him. I wonder, would you have had to have been invited? He wasn't there. He wasn't in Dover, Delaware yesterday. California. Of course, he could have been out on a banner trail.
Well, I would think he'd send somebody else in his way. You know, he could.
Does he have the authority to do that? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know.
it was, I need to research that.
You're on.
It's sort of noteworthy.
Thank you very much. My friend Phil has a name for you.
Okay, let's convene, please, so we can have the Q&A.
David, name was one thing. You said batshit crazy. No. Trump's approach. Oh, I thought you were talking about me. No.
All right. I think Professor Forsythe gave us a very concise and pointed view of the America First policy through the lens of foreign policy and what's happening here. It's very difficult, as you know, to talk about this current administration or any administration without leaning one way or the other in your presentation. I think that he did a marvelous job of trying to state things factually without his biases. If you didn't see him rolling his eyes, you would, if you only saw this in print, you'd say it was perfectly neutral. I should say that within the next week or so, everybody, both here on site and those who are watching via the YouTube remotely, will be receiving a very brief evaluation, and we do listen to them. They guide us in terms of your suggestions for topics for the subsequent years. Also, they guide us. Unfortunately, this has not happened very much, and who not to invite to speak another time. But we do take that into consideration, and we also make a report to the agency that funds us, Nebraska Humanities, and we need to give them the reflection of the participants in this series. So thank you again, and Sharon Sate and I will have microphones to walk around to take questions, and Jason Slaughter, our technical assistant, is watching the screen for the chat questions and comments that come up. There can be questions, but there also can be comments and reflections, and we might even have a discussion that ensues. So go ahead.
I mean, I can start with an online question. Do you think the UN can survive?
I'm not sure. It's a very good question. I think the UN is in desperate straits, certainly financially. Most of the UN programs run on voluntary donations. There's a required dues budget. There's also a required so-called peacekeeping budget. But most of the UN runs on voluntary donations. The coalition of states that has been mainly paying the bills is the United States and its allies. The West Europeans, Australia, Japan, etc. Most of these programs are being shut down or greatly reduced. As I indicated, the U.S., of course, likes its position in the UN Security Council, where it has a veto. But the Trump administration is really not committed to the success of the United Nations. It has pulled out of the World Health Organization, the UN Human Rights Council, as it's now called. Used to be the Commission, is now the Council. And consistent with other Republican administrations, the Trump administration finds the United Nations a sort of favorite whipping post for charges of corruption and inefficiency. That said, certainly the UN could be reformed. The UN is a sprawling system that has grown up over 70 years or so. And certainly some agencies should be pared back or eliminated, no question about it. But given lack of U.S. support, given the fact that because of Trump policies toward NATO, European states now have to spend more on security. The UK is cutting back on support for UN programming. Germany, these are big donors. These are really big donors, not just the US. At least now the US is beginning to pay some of its outstanding dues. So you have assigned dues according to a formula which is negotiated by states. States have to pay up, legally speaking. The US has paid up with delay. If your owed dues amount to 2 years' worth of dues, you lose your vote in the General Assembly automatically. The US has never wanted to lose its vote and be embarrassed that way. So what it does, it delays payments, and then it pays just enough to keep its vote in the General Assembly. At least the Trump administration has recently released a tranche of funding for the UN. So it's not total rejection of the UN, but it's not keen support either. I think I've cowed everybody into silence.
It's on.
Dave, a little off topic, but related, is the question put to Donald Trump a day or two ago about Russia providing assistance of several kinds to Iran, and the implications that has in terms of Russia's war with Ukraine, and the fact that Vladimir Zelensky has been and is apparently offering advice about drones to the U.S. So then Trump is asked, well, what do you think of that? And in his typical way, that's a stupid question. So he either attacks or deflects when he's asked a question he doesn't want to answer. Right. But I do think that that's very pivotal to all of the other things going on, whether it be Gaza or even Iran.
Well, these different issues are indeed linked. The bombing campaign in Iran is linked to whether India continues to buy oil from Russia, who is supplying drones to whom, who is supplying intelligence to whom. A, I'm not an expert on military intelligence. B, I think the whole question of the Russians supplying the Iranians with intelligence is overstated and overrated. There's a vast amount of information out there already through commercial channels which provide satellite photographs of American military bases in Bahrain or wherever. This is not a secret. You and I can go buy satellite images of American military bases. Where the Russian supply of intelligence might be useful is where you have the movement of American military forces, not the stationary bases and where the troops are positioned, but where you have the movement of U.S. military resources. But then again, does Iran have the military resources to do anything with this knowledge? I think if the bombing continues for another week or 2 weeks, or beyond that, Iran will not have anything to hit anybody with. The missiles will have been destroyed. The drones will have been destroyed. There is, I think, a point at which Iran runs out of military resources and assets to try to make trouble for the U.S., Israel, and others in the Middle East. But I don't think what we're hearing about Russian supply of intelligence to Iran is all that important. We, of course, have been supplying intelligence to Ukraine, and in that way we have been fighting against the Russians, and now the Russians are trying to do the same thing to us via Iran. But I don't see it as all that important, but I'm not an expert on military intelligence. And by the way, that was not a stupid question. It was quite on point.
No, Dave, that's a very interesting story you're painting today. And what I wonder about is maybe a silly question, but America first, or is it Trump and his buddies first? I mean, I see, honestly, I see
Yeah.
Jared Kushner
Yeah.
and other people
Yeah.
making big deals
Yeah.
with Israel and over Gaza and other things. And to me, it's mostly about money and Trump and how do we make it through this mess?
I think it's partly about that, and a lot of this is open. The amount of corruption by the Trump administration is just astounding. Selling Bibles, selling tennis shoes, selling this, that, and the other, and then you have Jared Kushner and Whitcroft being unofficial diplomats, not subject to the State Department, not subject to Senate confirmation. They're sort of freelancing on a whole series of issues at once. Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, all at once, you know. And Trump and Jared Kushner and Witkoff have personal economic interests in the Middle East and the Gulf sheikdoms or principalities or whatever. But there is, I think, evident, blatant corruption. I think Trump's family has enormously increased their wealth during the time he's been in the White House. But I don't think that's the be-all and end-all of American foreign policy. I think a lot has to do with Trump's personal need to dominate, to win, to own. He had to own Greenland. I've lived in Denmark twice, once in the middle of the country and once in Copenhagen. And the Danes are very pro-American. This whole thing was totally unnecessary. You know, the Danes are very pro-American. There was a Dane who was the top guy in NATO for a while, Rasmussen. Of course, every other person is named Rasmussen in Denmark, but the Danes are very pro-American, very strong supporters of NATO. It was totally, if we had approached the Danes and said, we need your cooperation in making sure that the Russians and the Chinese are under control in the Arctic Circle and they're in north of Greenland, the Danes would have cooperated. They'd have been very glad to cooperate within the NATO framework. They are anti-Russian, they are anti-Chinese, they are pro-American. But when you talk about, we're going to own Denmark, we're going to we're going to own Greenland, we're going to take Greenland, we might use military force, then the Danes activated their nationalism, which, by the way, is a kind of liberal nationalism, cosmopolitan nationalism. We went about it totally the wrong way. So it's not all, you can't explain everything by the Trump family's desire for money, but that's a part of it. There's that drive for power, drive for control, drive for we have to own it, we have to dominate, and that's a big part of it too.
I'm going to say two things and ask a question, and we have a couple more questions, including one on Zoom. But one, we ought to thank Priscilla Handy for doing the coffee for all of these sessions. And
Take some home.
okay, take some home. There's plenty. Secondly, since this YouTube site is publicly available, if you think you know people who would be interested in this topic, you can refer them to it, whether they've come to this series, whether they've registered or not, because this will be available online for quite some time. It's just the same. It's the same link as those of you who are home and are watching it here. Now, I have a question too. The Trump's dominance over foreign policy is in the same way like his dominance over domestic policy. Not only does he have the presidential podium, but he has the threat against people who are of his party to mount campaigns for opponents for them in primaries. And a lot of people who may not agree with him are silent. At least they're silent publicly. After November, after the midterm elections, and Trump doesn't have the same kind of power over people in his party that he does now, do you think that there will be people who will speak out against his dominant policy, and will that change things?
On foreign policy, I would say yes. I think you see this already on Denmark. There were a number of elected Republicans in Congress that criticized Trump policy on Denmark. I think you see it on other issues as well. You certainly saw it on immigration and deportation, which is a domestic and foreign policy issue at the same time. You know, it's right on the border between them. And if we assume that Trump doesn't rig the fall elections, one way or the other, if we assume he doesn't try to stay in the White House beyond what the Constitution allows, then he's in the last 2 years of his final term. He is a lame duck. And maybe he has lost control of the House, which would be huge. The Senate might be in play as well. For all of these reasons, I think there will be more outspoken resistance to his policies, particularly by elected Republicans, who have been there all along on Ukraine. There is a strong Republican contingent in Congress, plus a number of Democrats, who do see the issue in terms of Russian aggression and Ukraine democratic defense. You almost never hear Trump or Rubio or Hegseth discuss the situation in Ukraine with Russia in those terms: aggression, self-defense, democracy, human rights. It's always about power resources and real estate, and why doesn't Zelensky give up the eastern part of Ukraine and get it over with, and all of that. But there has always been a contingent, bipartisan contingent in Congress, that is much more interested in containing Russia and defending Ukraine than the White House. And I think you will see that become more open in Trump's last 2 terms, but again, assuming he doesn't try to play fast and loose with the congressional elections, and given what happened in 2020, you can't be sure that he won't try to improperly disrupt the elections. And you have to assume that he is not going to try to stay in the White House beyond what the Constitution states. So given those 2 assumptions, then I think you'll see more outspoken pushback against some badly considered policies. On the other hand, I think some policies could work out for Trump, on Iran, for example. I think he may win that politically. If you wind up in Iran with a kind of clerical regime 2.0 without much power, that's a win. That's a win. It's not a win for the Iranian people, but it's a win for the United States because this hypothetical new clerical regime will be so truncated that it can't make trouble for Israel. It can't continue to support Hezbollah. It can't continue to support with any significant resources the Houthis in Yemen. Assad is already gone in Syria. So sort of de facto, that could turn out to be a Trump win in terms of power politics. Not because it was well thought through or well calculated or well planned, but it could wind up a political win for the Trump team.
We have a question from YouTube, Jason.
Yeah, it kind of goes off what you just said here. What drives the support for the American First movement among the common voters? Events outside of the United States or what they see in the United States, such as immigration, etc.?
Yeah, well, for some MAGA supporters, it was the hope for a kind of neo-isolationist foreign policy where you don't initiate wars and you don't get involved militarily in messy situations abroad. You have that part of the MAGA base. You have that part of the MAGA base which is very much in favor of mass deportations. Despite everything that ICE has done, if you look at the polling numbers, ICE is very popular with MAGA Republicans. A hard line on immigration and deportation is not supported by American public opinion in general, but it is supported by the MAGA voters. So they are very much on board for that sort of thing. A number of Trump policies continue to be supported by the MAGA base. But the isolationists have now, for the moment, defected. But that leaves the people that want a hard line on deportation and some other issues.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
No? Okay.
No.
Oh, okay.
Aha.
What about tariff policy? Is that driving allies to other non-allied countries like China and India?
Yeah, well, we had a whole session on trade and tariffs. I wish the speaker had been a little more forthright, but there's nothing anybody can do to me, so I'll tell you what I think. I mean, they can't deny me tenure. The university could cut off my email, but they could take my parking spot, but that's about it. I think Trump tariff policy is absolutely crazy. It's unnecessary. It's useless. It's harmful. To sort of do a trade war with every other state on the planet, including your allies, you know, including Canada and everybody in NATO, including Switzerland, where I spend a lot of time. I mean, who cares if the Swiss sell us a bunch of watches and chocolates and some pharmaceuticals? How important is that? They sell us more than we sell them. I think the tariff policy has driven Canada to trade deals with China and India. The Canadian Prime Minister said that nostalgia is not a strategic policy. Longing for the good old days of close relations is not an adequate strategic policy for Canada. We have to go strike trade deals with other countries to make us less dependent on the United States. And in the meantime, Canadians don't much visit in the U.S. anymore. They don't much spend winter holidays in Florida or anywhere else. They don't buy bourbon from Kentucky, you know. It's totally needless. Canada is one of the best allies we ever had. 1979, Iranian Revolution, takeover of the American embassy. Canada helped get Americans out of Iran. They hid them, they got them out. It's totally useless to pick a trade war with Canada. Very few illegal drugs come in from Canada, you know. The whole thing is totally badly thought out, ill-considered, and presumably, it depends, the next administration will change that policy.
Okay, well, thank you. Oh, wait, Marvin has one.
The
And
New York Times is just reporting that the son of the Khamenei has been named the new supreme leader in Iran, so
Yeah.
no change.
well, he better stay in a bunker.
Yeah.
Following up on what you were just saying,
Barry, hold on. Last question.
following up on your discussion about tariffs, do you see any real possibility that maybe the EU and Canada and that group of countries will end up in a stronger situation, more dependent on each other, less dependent on the U.S., and actually benefit in some ways from Trump's craziness, that they will grow from this painful experience?
I hate to end on a note of ambivalence, but I really don't know the answer to that question. I'm not an expert on economics, trade, and tariffs. The Europeans already rely heavily on each other through the European Union, you know. I would just comment, to go back to a long history, the original U.S. position toward Europe after World War II is we want to support them through the Marshall Plan. We want a stable area of democratic capitalism, not subject to extremist ideologies. And if that means they compete with us economically in trade, okay, fine. But what we want is Europe, democratic, capitalist, stable, and aligned with U.S. and can rely on us to defend them against the Soviet Union. What you have now, particularly in Europe, is not trusting Washington, not trusting U.S. foreign policy. And so their going it alone will lead to an arms race. You have a big arms race now in Europe. Germany has been Pacific for a long time. It's going to have to now do a lot of spending on the military to try to contest Russia. That's going to hurt their domestic welfare program. That's going to make trouble for the German government at home. And it all comes back to their view that the U.S. is no longer a reliable ally. That's not a good thing. That's not a good development. And hopefully, starting with the congressional elections in the fall, the U.S. can begin to turn this around. So that's my effort to end on a more positive note.
That's your swan. Thank you. Thank you very much.